All right, it's about a minute after 2, so I think we'll go ahead and get started again. This is Blake Tarushi from Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I also have Jessica Fry on the line with me, and she'll be doing the bulk of the presenting today. Just a reminder, we are going to be recording this webinar and posting it to our website. The attendees are in listen-only mode, so you'll need to type in your questions in the control panel, and we'll try our best to get those answered. We'll also try our best to keep those anonymous, so feel free to ask whatever questions you might have, and I won't drop your name for the whole world to know the questions that you asked. But just keep that in mind that we'll be recording it and posting it to the website. So Jessica, if you want to go ahead and advance the slide. You can see the agenda. Just want to briefly touch on last year's grant program and the results of that, and the grant criteria for the upcoming year, the July 2018 accuracy report and how to go about reading that. And then we'll get into the errors that we see quite often and how to mitigate those. So go ahead and advance the next slide. Well, never mind, I'll get there in a second. So in 2018, you can see the GIS grant information. 49 counties ended up receiving grant funds for a total of $762,000, almost $763,000. So, you know, really only reached about half of the counties with that. That was the application process that we've gone away from in the current fiscal year. If you go to the next slide. Hopefully none of the current fiscal year, the 2019, is a surprise to anyone. We've talked about it at a number of regional supervisor meetings, as well as a number of 911 council meetings, and sent out quite a bit of email information as well. And again, just to kind of capture what we're doing or why the change, in the past with the grant, we basically awarded projects. Basically, if a local jurisdiction came up with a project towards NextGen GIS data creation or maintenance, it was approved and you'd receive your money for that project. But there was no quality control or kind of so what behind that process. There was no benchmarks for data. Basically, you could do your project. The vendors or the staff that did that work were able to get the funding. That was great, it got it off the ground, but we're getting to the point now where we have to start using that data, and we have to make sure the data is good. And that's kind of the reason for the change on how we're going about doing the grant program. So we are doing benchmarks this year. So the first benchmark is overall GIS data accuracy, and you can see the data layers that are required. And those need to be at least 98%, which includes submission of all of those data layers. We'll get into some of the errors and some of maybe the concerns a little bit later on. If you go to the next slide, the next benchmark is ALI and MPEG synchronization. If you remember when we initially rolled this thought process out, these benchmarks were much higher. I think we had them initially at like 95%, but as we looked at the current accuracy rates, we thought that was a bit aggressive. So we knocked that down to 50% or above. And the reason being, we want to provide this grant funding, but we also have to drive improvement. So we settled on 50%, at least for this year, thinking that was still a benchmark that should be attainable, but some would still have to strive to get there. So, so for both ALI and MPEG syncs, that's at 50% or above. So kind of three categories: overall GIS, ALI, and MPEG. If you go to the next slide. And then we also wanted to provide a little bit of a grace period or grace window where, you know, if you were making a good faith effort, you would still be able to receive the funding. And that is, if you meet two of the criteria, so say 98% GIS, 50% in ALI, but you're lacking on MPEG, but you've at least increased your accuracy by 25% or more, you would still be eligible to receive that grant funding. So kind of 2 out of 3 have to still meet the accuracy and then show improvement in the third to be able to receive the funding. Next slide, please. And then the overall process is we're looking to get that data at least twice a year. So 2 periods that we will be analyzing and kind of rewarding your jurisdictions for meeting those benchmarks. The first 6 months, July through December, if you upload your data and you meet the benchmarks, you will receive a reimbursement of $6,000 that month, or basically we're going to make those payments on a monthly basis. So the next time we make those monthly payments, you would be reimbursed. And then again, a second upload period, the second 6 months of the year, between January and June, would make you eligible for an additional $6,000. And then just the caveat that if you miss the first period, you're still eligible for the second period, but at that point, you know, there's no way to go back and get the first $6,000. So at that point, you'd only be eligible for the second and final and a total of $6,000. So if you miss one, unfortunately, you're out for that particular 6-month period, but you're still eligible in the other 6-month period. If you go to the next slide. I think at this point is when I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, but just real quick, I did send out this QAQC report towards the beginning of July. It's also in the handouts that are listed in the control panel. So if for some reason you haven't taken a look at it in its entirety, it is attached to this webinar and you can download it if you so choose. And just a reminder that if there are any questions, go ahead and pop them into the question part of the control panel, and we'll try to get those answered just as fast as we can, or at least as soon as it's relevant. So Jessica, go ahead.
Thank you, Blake. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I talk about how to interpolate the accuracy report that was sent out by Blake, I just want to let everybody know that if you do not meet all of the criteria, we will be setting up individual calls with your jurisdiction. So we'll talk more about that at the end. However, I wanted to make sure that you knew up front that any specific questions on, I don't understand this specific thing about my county's data, we'd be happy to answer during those calls too. So if something comes up and you miss it, there's still an opportunity to ask those questions. So to start with, on the accuracy report, I want to point out just a few things. Blake has gone through and highlighted the items that you need to be most concerned about. Of course, the first one is if your county name is highlighted in green, where the county name is, then you meet the criteria that's been set forth for the six months already. When we go to look at, there we go. When we go to look at QC fallout, or what is your GIS data accuracy, it's this column here. And reminder, the criteria is at or above 98%. So, you know, if you're over 98%, you meet that criteria. The second one is the alley to road centerline synchronization, and that criteria is at or above 50%. So, and then when we look at the MSAG, because we do 2 different runs on the MSAG, we're looking at both the low range and the high range. That accuracy is an average between both the high and the low. You will notice that in each one of these categories, there is a previous and a current. So previous would be submission before your last submission, and current is your last submission. So you can see if there's differences in the number of errors or differences in the number of the percentage between the previous and the current. So when you receive this report next month, you will see any changes if you do happen to upload your data. With that being said, also remember that ALI and MSAG synchronization is only completed every quarter, once a quarter. So we have run the data for the second quarter, and we'll be running the third quarter in September, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The last one to look at on this report is the submission within the last 6 months. So on the right-hand side, you will see a date. That date is when we last received an upload from your jurisdiction. So it's year, month, and then day. So anything that has not been, any date that is before January 1st, 2018 we have not received in more than 6 months. So just keep that in mind, and if you want to see that change, submit your data to us. A couple of other things on, yep.
Sorry, real quick, there was a question that I want to kind of address before you move on. So there's a question, are the funds given each month, so $1,000 each month, or is it a lump sum of $6,000 twice each year? And it is a lump sum. So as soon as you meet that criteria, the next time we do the payments, you would receive the $6,000. And then just another clarification, for the counties that already do meet those requirements, again, you still do have to upload your data in this 6-month window. So starting out anytime, and as long as your benchmarks don't decrease at all, there should be no issues, and you would receive your $6,000 check. We are just highlighting those that, you know, as long as you maintain or improve, you're good already. So none of the checks have gone out yet. The first time we would do that is after we receive like the August 1st report. And if you've uploaded then in July and you meet the criteria, you're good to go, you'd receive your check.
Thank you, Blake. A couple of other things on the report. I know some of you may be seeing zeros in your ALI or your MPEG synchronization. A couple of issues there to keep in mind. One of them could purely be there's a standardization issue between the road names. So you have the traditional cutoff elements of the 911 databases, and your GIS data reflects the actual road name. So that could be one issue. The other issue could simply be that your MSAG community and your ESN is missing off of your GIS data, or you have those elements in your data, but the field mapping spreadsheet has not been updated to reflect it. So any jurisdiction that is currently reading a 0, when we have those individual calls, we'll talk about what the major issue is with those zeros. The next item, if I can get my PowerPoint to cooperate here, the next item is an NA. What that means is that we have not received a data set from the jurisdiction. Whatever that data set may be, there's only one that doesn't have GIS data submitted yet, but there are several that have ALI and MSAG. So the protocol for that would be to ensure that we receive an ALI and MSAG from you within the next couple of months in order to do that synchronization this quarter. Okay. With that being said, on how to read the report and what you're seeing in the report, I'd like to just cover some general errors that we're seeing that's not really county specific, but it's more just generally what we're finding. So one of the issues that we are finding is that not all of the required GIS data layers have been submitted by jurisdictions. So the response boundaries, while listed, are not the majority of them. It really comes down to PSAP boundary and authoritative boundary. With that being said, those boundaries actually could be provided by your jurisdiction already, but in the field mapping spreadsheet, we don't know that your PSAP boundary and your authoritative boundary is your county boundary. So in those cases, and if you are missing those, I will be letting you know. It may simply be we need to update the field mapping spreadsheet so that we know that this data layer is the same thing for these other data layers. Another item is that the field mapping spreadsheet could simply be out of date. You all have done a tremendous amount of work on your GIS data, have added fields, have changed names. We try to catch those as they're coming in. However, sometimes it's just not possible for us to catch absolutely everything. So if you see that it seems like you're missing an entire field, for example, that may be the case where we just need to get your field mapping spreadsheet updated. And we'd be happy to provide those back to you so that you have a copy of what you provided to us. Also, keep in mind that we are checking for unique IDs by feature now, but that is not part of this accuracy. So when you get the results back from the Iowa team, they will tell you how many duplicate site or unique IDs that you have for your road center lines and site structure address points, but that is not reflected in the accuracy, but it is vitally important. And I already made the comment that's at the bottom. Just make sure that if you aren't seeing an accuracy or are seeing that you're not submitting authoritative boundary or PSAP boundary, that you may just be providing it to us as the county boundary and we're not aware that that is the case.
Hey, Jessica, I'm going to make you pause real quick just to answer a couple questions. Sometimes your numbers may go down when the work is done before they go up. Will that be penalized? We're not going to do that. We're not penalizing you for numbers that might go down. That's normally an oddity or kind of a human error. If you've uploaded once and it meets that criteria, you get your $6,000 during that period. We're not going to withhold anything in the second period or try to recoup it or anything like that. So if something weird does happen and your numbers go down, you're safe. You get to keep your $6,000 that we've probably already sent you. And then another question is, so currently my county doesn't meet the requirements for MSAG. We're in the process of fixing these. Will we still make the first payment of $6,000? And if so, what's the cutoff date? So great. I'm glad you're trying to mitigate those errors. You really have until December 31st, and then you wouldn't miss. You're not missing out on anything. So again, we want it uploaded at some point during the first 6 months, and if it meets that criteria at any point, you get the $6,000. And one that just popped in, apologies if I missed it earlier, is this still $12,000 per PSAP? Yes. So for counties with multiple PSAPs, it is still per PSAP. If anyone has any long-term feedback on that, not making any changes this year, not necessarily making any changes next year, but it's been brought up or been in my mind, maybe at some point it's done, a set amount per county. But at the moment, it is the $12,000 total per PSAP. So just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. So a couple of other common GIS data issues to keep in mind. The first one is GIS data being submitted outside of the authoritative boundary. Remember that we're not telling you to only submit county for inside your authoritative boundary. So for instance, if you have data that in the surrounding counties that you have in your same data set, you do not need to remove those before you send those to us. However, it is very important that you put the 999 exception code on those features so that, first of all, they're not being checked and you're not being penalized for those that you cannot make corrections to. But also, when we look at the data in the statewide data set, if you don't exception code those out, then we find duplicates, sometimes triplets, sometimes quadruplets of the same features being shown within a jurisdiction, and it's hard to make decisions on which one is correct. So keep that in mind. And then the final kind of just general thing is we're seeing some where the mandatory fields aren't populated. Those mandatory fields are all marked with an M in the MCO column of the field mapping spreadsheet. And if you have any questions on what should be populated there, let us know. There are a couple of exceptions that I didn't write them down here, but I would like to mention them. In the PSAP boundary layer, there are a couple of mandatory attributes for agency URL and a URI. Those, while mandatory, will be provided by the NextGen 911 call routing provider. So at this time, those can be left blank because we don't know yet what those are supposed to be. So that's really the common GIS data issues. I want to talk briefly about boundaries. And as always, if somebody has a question, feel free to pop it in there and Blake will answer those as they come in. Boundary issues, we are still seeing a lot of gaps and overlaps with the boundaries. Try your best to get those closed up. A lot of times there is a possibility that a polygon can accidentally be moved or vertices can actually accidentally be deleted, and we're getting entire polygons being covered by other polygons. So just check those and make any corrections that you need to there. That should prevent errors from also being identified with the breaks at boundary changes, because those really kind of throw off that check too, because it's looking for boundary breaks that really shouldn't be there. Blake, any questions yet come in on anything that I've covered thus far?
One on boundaries. How is
Okay.
how is data that is inside the PSAP boundary but outside the authoritative boundary checked?
So if they're exception coded out, they would not be checked. There is a check with the authoritative boundary that will come back and say that this many features or this feature is outside the authoritative boundary. If that happens to be the case for your jurisdiction, and I know one county off the top of my head that would affect, let's have a discussion about that and figure out what we need to do, because we don't want you to be penalized for those. So whichever specific county that is for, if you would just send me an email and we can have that discussion when I make the individual calls. That's a hard one. Any other ones, Blake?
Nope, not at the moment.
Okay. Okay, so Road Centerlines. Road Centerlines, it's really kind of a hodgepodge of things that are going on, and it really kind of is specific to each individual jurisdiction. But I did want to bring up a few things that kind of seems to be over a lot of the jurisdictions. The first one is we do a check to identify where the from ranges are higher than the to ranges. Now, in some cases, these could or should be allowable. And if there is a case where that is actually how your road goes in your jurisdiction and they are being marked as errors at this time, please use the exception code, and I will make sure that you know what the exception codes are. We'll kind of send out a reminder, but all of those exception codes are in the user's guide on the portal. You should be able to find them there. It's very specific on what the error check is, and it tells you exactly what the exception code to use is. Range overlaps. There's a couple of issues with this. One of them could be that you have ranges with exactly the same road name elements, but the ranges are the same somewhere within two segments, or it could be a single segment where the ranges are overlapping on both sides. So look for those kind of things. Sometimes those can trip us up, and we kind of really have to look to see what those are. Sometimes they're not easy to identify. With the range parity, that's where we have a mix of odd and even values on the odd side. There is a parity left and right field. Some jurisdictions are using it, some jurisdictions are not. It would be a good idea to go in and populate those. Of course, O for odd, E for even, B for both, or Z for zero. And the zero would be used in the cases where you have really short segments between interstates, so turnarounds that don't have any addressable structures. Zeros are allowed to be on both the to and the from on those, on both the left and the right. The Centerline's not, yep.
What is the code for a road centerline segment ends in a dangling node when it's not actually dangling, just a T intersection, for instance, or a road ends there?
Right, so that exception code and perfect timing is now up on the screen. That's 203. So that would be where you would find the dangle errors. Dead ends are another thing that we see where it gets marked as a dangle, but there really is no dangle. That's where the road ends. I kind of touched on the road center lines not split at the boundary change earlier. With that being said, if you are a jurisdiction who is seeing a lot of errors with the road center lines not being split at boundary changes, there is a great potential that if you make a correction to the road segment, that you will fix multiple errors or multiple errors at the same time, because typically our fire law and medical all are split at the same spots. That may or may not be the case in your jurisdictions, but a lot of the times it is. So if you are finding that a road is not split at the boundary change, take a look. Maybe you make the correction and you fix 3 or more errors at one time. Also, keep in mind on the boundary splits, if if the segment goes over the boundary just a little bit and then it's split, so let's just say it's like a foot over and then it's split, that also will come up as an error. So make sure that those road center lines are snapped to those boundaries. The next error is snapping, and this is when the segments need to be snapped to adjacent segments or overshoot has occurred, or the segments are not split at intersections. There is one exception to that case, and that's the overpasses, where there's an overpass and the road doesn't actually intersect the other road. Then you really do need to make sure you use the exception code 200 on that. Any other questions come in, Blake, before I go to the last one on the road center lines?
Nope, not at the moment.
Okay. The very last one to talk about with road center lines is values outside of domains. And really what we are looking for there, or what the checks are looking for there, is that your pre, post directional, and post types meet the USPS abbreviations. These can easily be found on the internet, searching for Pub 28 or Publication 28 from the U.S. Postal Service, but they are also listed in the user's guide on the portal. So both of those places, you can find those. Now, I do know there are some cases where the official abbreviation as provided by a jurisdiction is not correct. Terrace happens to be one where we find that a lot of people are using the wrong abbreviation, but that's what the authoritative jurisdiction has provided. In those cases, there are exception codes to make sure that that isn't marked as an error.
Okay, now there's a question though.
Okay.
Is it required to split road center lines at law, fire, etc. boundaries? I don't want to do that because my CAD software requires road segments to not be split between intersections. It has to do with displaying correct info to dispatchers.
Yeah, so the protocol and everything that's in the documentation says that those need to be split. However, I am aware of several cases where CAD systems need to use something that's a little bit different than that. And the one thing that I can say is that if the NextGen 911 call routing provider is not sending you information on who the fire, law, and EMS is, but your CAD provides that information, then that is not necessary. So in the cases where CAD providers give you which responder to send to the call, you would need to use the exception code for those. I hope that makes sense. If not, you can reach out to me. Any more questions, Blake?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Site structure address points. The biggest area that we find with site structure address points is the duplicates. And there are valid reasons to have duplicate addresses in data sets. What we find is that most of the time they're missing the unit information or the unit information, building information, something to make it unique. There's a couple of options there. Either add the unit information if it is available and known, or use the exception code 402 to ensure that all of the points containing that same address are not checked for duplicates. So as you work through adding unit information, remove your exception code, but until then, make sure that exception code is on there. There are some jurisdictions that have a lot of address points and they have hundreds of errors for duplicate address points when the address is valid, it's just missing the unit information. And I might mention here that for the exception codes, you can have multiple exception codes on a feature. How you would deal with that is to put the first exception code in, use a comma, and add the next exception code, no space between them. So you could have as many as you need to for that feature. Remember, if they're 999 exception code, that means that they will not be checked and they will not be in the statewide system, so you don't have to use multiple codes if it's 999. Again, Check for mandatory fields not being populated. You know, if it's mandatory, if it's marked with an M, make sure that it's populated with the correct information. And a lot of those they're all populated the same. The county name, the state name, US, those kind of things. Address point to road centerline parity. This is where we are identifying addresses that are even on an odd side of the road or odd on an even side of the road. We do know that that happens in the real world. A lot of older addresses have the incorrect address number, being it's supposed to be odd and it's even. In those cases, use the exception code 401. One more slide here for the site structure address points. The address point to road centerline range compare. This is identifying address points where the name elements match. However, the house number does not fit the range on that side of the road. So for instance, if you had an address 125 along a segment, but the segment address low doesn't start till 127, it will say, hey, that's an error. Those would be where you need to go and make adjustments to your ranges to ensure that that 125 is within those ranges. Segment compare. This is one where it's looking for the point is located spatially along the correct segment. Most of the time, range corrections are required. However, I will tell you, working with several jurisdictions, that there are some exceptions to this. If you have large lots that are addressed off of the structure that the drive is on, but the point, the centroid of the structure, for example, is spatially located closer to a segment that's behind it, that will come up as an error. Again, use the exception code for that. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it is within the user's guide, and feel free to send us an email and we'll be able to help you with that. The final one here is values outside of domain. Again, the U.S. Postal Service abbreviations are what we're looking for. If you have a case where you don't use something that's the official abbreviation, then make sure you use the exception code. But please do try very hard to make sure that those are correct. You know, AV is not the official abbreviation of avenue, it's AVE. So make sure that you put those in there. Any questions, Blake, come in on site structure address points?
No, not at this time.
Okay, well, moving right along then, let's talk about MSAG and some of the common issues here. So the first one is that the address cannot be found in a compatible range. So when we do the MSAG synchronization, we're looking at, does the low address and the high address fit within the range? There are cases where your MSAGs may have different ranging than your road center lines. If your road center lines are actual ranges and your MSAG is theoretical ranges, you may see an increase in the number of errors between those. So anything that's looking for ranges on the MSAG, keep in mind theoretical versus actual. As we move into a NextGen environment and your road center line becomes your MSAG in the NextGen environment, those issues will go away. However, in the meantime, we need to make sure that none of our landline or wireline addresses who are using currently today the alley are going to be orphaned in the NextGen environment. So there's kind of a play between both the alley and the MSAG synchronization. If you're one of those jurisdictions that uses actual ranges, we will reach out to you because we want to make sure that you're not penalized for actual versus theoretical, but we still need to do the checks. Address found multiple times. This is where we're potentially seeing two road segments that have the same MSAG street names and ranges on them. So that range overlap issue that we talked about in the road center lines could be at the reason why we're seeing multiple addresses found. So basically it's saying, hey, I find this MSAG record twice in the Road Centerline. Okay, now let's talk about probably one of the things that seems to be most common in the state of Iowa. The first one is that the address is found in a different community. I know that MSAG communities are very hard to define. They're about as easy as getting the U.S. Postal Service to tell you what the postal city is and being all over the place. But we are seeing some significant differences between communities in the GIS data and the MSAG. When you're looking at these errors, you really need to figure out and work both with the 911 and the GIS to figure out what is the actual community name. So the change may not need to be to the MSAG, it may need to be to the GIS data, or vice versa. To go along with that, if you have a MSAG record that is found in a different community in ESN, it may be the community and not the ESN. However, we are finding that there are few MSAG databases and even ALI databases that are being provided with a leading 0 in the ESN. And if you could remove that leading 0 before you submit your ALI and your MSAG, that will improve your synchronization results. Some of those 0 percentages that I was talking about when we first started this call may be caused because of these leading zeros. So just check that out. The easiest thing to do is open your MSAG and your ALI and look at your ESN values on your ESN values in your GIS data, your Road Centerline and your site structure address points. If there's a leading 0, make sure you remove that. The ESN, different ESN, it's the same issue there. We've talked about it. They're all kind of interrelated there. Blake, any questions come in on that?
2 of them. This one is relevant with where you're at now. On the ESN, what about 3 digits? That's what is usually delivered to the PSAP.
As long as your GIS data has 3 digits and your ALI has 3 digits and your MSAG has 3 digits, you have no issue. If you have more than 1 leading 0, that also you'll need to take care of that. Not finding that to be very common. It mainly is one leading 0 where it's a 4-digit ESN. But you can also contact us and we'll be able to help with you with that too.
And then the next question, is the discrepancy viewer going to be updated for 10.5 and 10.6 and available for download on the portal site? And then any options forthcoming for ArcGIS Pro as well to view discrepancies? Yeah,
I will have to check on the Arc Pro question. I have not heard anything about that recently. I do know that I was told that the team was working on ARC 10.5 version for the discrepancy viewer. I don't recall off the top of my head what the date or the timeline was on that, but I will double check on that too, and send out an email to everybody so that you know. Okay.
And that was it for now.
Okay, very good. So one more slide on the MSAG synchronization issues. Again, the addresses higher or addresses lower, there could potentially be differences between actual ranges and theoretical or potential ranges. Again, let us know. You can let myself know. Everybody should have my email address, and I will provide the Iowa team's email address at the end of the presentation today. But we would kind of like to know if that might be the case in your jurisdiction. And then finally, is the no matching street name found? And while we see quite a few of these errors, the major issue between the ALI and the MSAG, I'm going to throw the ALI in here for a minute because it's the same thing, But the major difference that we're seeing between the GIS data and the traditional 911 databases are where the database providers have cut abbreviations or cut the TH off of first or off of third or fifth, whatever the case may be, in order to save space many, many, many years ago. So if your GIS data has First Street as one ST space ST, and your MSAG has one space ST, it cannot match those because it has to be a one-to-one match. One thing that we have to remember is that GIS, we can use geocoders, we can program it to know that this means this. In a 911 system, you can't have any type of place for errors for that to occur. So if it's one ST space ST in the GIS data, then that needs to be reflected in the traditional MSAG and ALI databases too. It's hard for us GIS people to wrap our heads around that because we can do so many things in GIS, but we have to remember that the 911 systems are flat files, and a lot of those flat files will continue to exist in the future in NextGen systems, regardless of how hard we're trying to push them forward. And so we just can't have that flexibility in the system for it to inadvertently send the call to the wrong PSAP and it not be delivered and the response to be slowed down. So keep that in mind. I have talked to a couple of jurisdictions recently trying to figure out what's the best process to get their traditional 911 providers to update that data. We've talked to some counties that are using providers who say, yeah, we'll allow you to give us a spreadsheet and mass update that. So if that happens to be the case in your jurisdiction, reach out to your provider and find out what is the best way to go about making those mass changes. So finally, here with the MSAGs, I wanted to provide a list of counties that we need a new MSAG for. So any county that's listed here, your MSAG is a year or more old. So we really need a new one because we may be checking an old MSAG against newer GIS data, and you may have made changes to your MSAG, and we want to make sure that we're getting the correct data. So if your county is listed here, if you can get a copy of your MSAG submitted to the portal before the end of August, that will be used for the third quarter synchronization. Any other questions come in on MSAG?
No, not at this point.
Okay. So ALI to Road Centerline, I'm not going to focus a whole lot on ALI because a lot of the things I covered in the MSAG are going to be identical to what is occurring with your ALI to Road Centerline synchronization. However, because this presentation is going to be provided out by Blake after this call, I wanted to make sure that everything was included in here so that you all could go back to reference it. One of the unique things with ALI is you may be a county who's getting a lot of errors for no house number. What we find is that these no house numbers are caused due to the VoIP, wireless, and foreign exchange records that exist in the ALI database. What we ask from you is that you take a look at your ALI before you submit it and remove any of those prior to uploading to the portal. Pretty easy. Typically, there's not a whole lot of these. Pretty easy to use a filter in Excel in order to identify those and remove those from your data set. If you need pointers on it, feel free to reach out. We'll be able to help you on that. The one thing different with ALI than MSAG is if you have an address cannot be found, or it falls in a gap, or it's higher than or lower than a range, those are where you need to take a look at your road ranges to make sure that all of your addresses are part of the ranging. It's a pretty good indicator that you're using actual ranges and that you need to make some adjustments in order to incorporate the address points into there. Pretty easy to figure out, pretty easy to identify. Have any questions on that, we'll be happy to help you out. Also, when we're looking at the addresses, we do find several jurisdictions who have that address found multiple times or multiple times on the same feature. Like the MSAG, that has to do a lot with the overlapping ranges. So a lot of times, a lot of these errors will be rectified by just correcting ranges on your Road Centerline. I already mentioned the community ESN differences that we're seeing between them. Here again, check for leading zeros in your ESN. Take a quick peek. If you're on the 911 side and you're responsible for the ALI and MSAG, you might want to provide a copy of that to your GIS person if you are using a local resource to check to see if those leading zeros are going to cause issues. Sometimes the leading zeros are in the GIS data and it doesn't cause a problem, and by removing them, you could potentially cause an issue. But on our individual calls, we'll go over those issues and talk about what you need to do. Last slide on ALI to Road Centerline synchronization. We already talked about the top two, and we talked about the last one, the no matching street found. When we talked about the MSAG, again, look at your post directionals, pre-directionals, and your post types. Could very easily be that your GIS data has AVE and your ALI has AV. With that being said, a lot of times that can be resolved by correcting your MSAG. I know in some jurisdictions making changes to your MSAG doesn't necessarily mean that that will trickle down to your ALI. So if you don't know that process, reach out to your local 911 database provider and find out what that process is and how that works. Last thing, before we talk about which counties need to submit new ALIs, we do realize that you only receive one free copy of your ALI every year. That requesting one may cost a significant portion of money in order to see synchronization results change there. What we would like to ask you to do is, if you could please provide a marked up copy of either the error report that we provide back to you saying we've made these change requests to the 911 data provider, or if you have the ability to provide the electronic record of change from the E911 database portal that you use to change or update your ALI, then provide that. Pretty good indication if you get an MSAG on a more regular timeline and your MSAG goes from 0 to 98% or higher, that you have then resolved your ALI errors. So we'll work through those. It's just kind of unfortunate that you only do get one free one a year.
Couple questions.
Oh, sure.
How is the QC fallout % error calculated?
So specifically for the GIS data checks, what happens there is the number of errors are counted from all of the checks. So the second column, I think, says current. It will have the total number of fallouts. The total number of features, which is the next column, is actually a calculation of all of the features by data layer by the number of checks. So for example, the ESN or the law enforcement boundary has 3 checks. It checks for value, it checks for overlaps, and it checks for gaps. So if your law enforcement boundary has 5 features, there are 3 checks. The number of features that go into the percentage is 3 times 5 or 15. And if anybody has questions about that, when I reach out to you, I'd be happy to explain how that is. So the Road Centerlines has the most checks, and I can't remember, it's something like 18 checks. And so it would be your Road Centerline feature count times 18, for example.
And another question is asking about the individual report listing the errors for a particular county. Have you sent that out? I know I've seen kind of the county specific errors and it looks very similar to the QAQC report. Is there anything else, or have you sent that report out that lists the individual errors?
So the counties receive a error report each time they upload. One of the results of the QAQC checks is the errors back to you. Now those don't have your Road Centerline is 98% accurate, for example. However, I have used the latest reports, so the ALI, MSAG, and GIS reports, and have those put together. And I will start getting those sent out tomorrow and then next week. I will send them out to those counties who are not meeting the 98% or 50% for ALI and MSAG first, and then send it out to everyone else. But they're developed, we just haven't gotten them sent out yet. Any other questions, Blake?
Nope, doesn't look like it.
Okay, very good. Well, just a couple of more slides here, and then our webinar will be complete. On this slide, if your county is listed, we do need a new ALI database submitted. They are all over 1 year old. So you should be able to either request one, or if you have received one in the last few months, if you can upload that to the portal, then it will be used to do the synchronization next quarter. Also, if you need the current CenturyLink ALI request form, you can send me an email. My email address is there, and I would be happy to send that out to you. It seems to be that we're getting those ALI databases back a little bit more quickly from CenturyLink now that Missy is the point of contact on that. So I would make the suggestion that if you need to request it, you do it soon, but there shouldn't be a huge delay on those. And finally, if your county is listed that says we need a new ALI or an MSAG, and you know that you have submitted it recently, and I have your name, your county name listed there, if you could let me know, we'll do some tracking down. However, I went back to check everything we had in our data stores, and I'm pretty sure the list is correct. Okay, the last one before we close and have any additional questions, the next step is counties not meeting all the criteria will be contacted via email to set up a call. I have a SurveyMonkey survey developed. I have sent the link to Blake, and Blake will be sending that survey link out with the copy of this PowerPoint for you to submit when you would be available for a half-hour call. We'll start with a half-hour call. If we need more, we can definitely schedule more. But if you all can get that filled out just as soon as possible, I'm looking at starting those next week, and I want to make sure that I can get some scheduled for early in the week so that we can get some of this work going. Mass changes to your MSAG and ALI, please contact your E911 database provider for instructions. It may be simply they provide you a spreadsheet, you fill out the spreadsheet of the changes and submit it back to them. It also may be that you're going to have to provide those one at a time on their portal. It just depends on the jurisdiction. If you have any questions in the future on how to handle specific GIS, ALI, or MSAG errors, you can send those to the Iowa team at geocom, and the email address is on here, iowateam@geo-com.com. And the group of us receive those emails, and we make sure that we can get those answered for you just as quickly as possible. The last thing here is be sure to submit new ALI and MSAG databases to the portal by August 31st in order to have your synchronization results available for September. the end of September. So we want to see improvement in both of those areas. So if in doubt, submit a new one. With that being said, Blake, I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Now we can take any questions or any last items from your side.
Yep, and there's one more question that popped in that I can answer, and like Jessica said, we're wrapping up here, so if you do have any last questions, make sure to pop them in the little question window now, and we'll get them addressed, or both of us are available offline as well. This question is regarding kind of the grant process and the payments again. We have a county GIS coordinator who will be doing all the submissions. Will the payment still come to the PSAP? The way we do the payments is the same across the board, really, and that is it goes to the county service board. And the way we wrote this, it's basically yours to spend with any expenses you might have under 34A. It doesn't have to necessarily be reinvested in GIS. It certainly can be, but anything under 34A would be an eligible use of the funds that you end up receiving. The next question that just came in, I could use an ESN map for the state, not getting information on neighboring counties by asking for it. I know I have a list, a spreadsheet of ESNs by PSAP. I'm not sure how up to date it is. Jessica, do you have anything that might help? If not, I can reach out and send what I have to the person that asked this.
Yeah, I don't, because the ESN boundary isn't a mandatory layer, don't believe that we have anything that comes out. I will follow up with the team, but I'm pretty sure that there's nothing that we can get out relatively quickly. So probably your list is the best list.
Okay, sounds good. Well, if there is nothing else, like I said, I will be getting the slides out as well as the SurveyMonkey with the link to sign up for a one-on-one call shortly. And then also, hopefully either by the end of the week or first thing next week, be able to get the entire webinar posted online. So if you know of anyone that missed it or was interested, couldn't attend today, it will be posted online. And like I said, if any other questions come up after we hang up here, feel free to reach out to us. And it looks like nothing else has popped in here, and it is the end of the hour. So just want to say thank you for your time today. Appreciate all the work that you've done, and hopefully this answered a lot of your questions, and have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.